is a story that is a poser, not a riddle, but a teaser that may tease something out of us. It's the story about 4 young peasant girls who were drawing water from a well, and they were sharing with each other their daydreams. And one of the girls said, "I have an uncle who's going to ride up in a golden carriage and take me away to a place where I will have everything that I ever wanted." And the second said, "I have an uncle who's going to ride up and take me to a man who's going to marry me and make me happy." And the third one said, "I have an uncle who is going to provide me with all the needs that I will ever desire when the desire comes up." But the fourth, who was the prettiest of them all, was sad because she was an orphan and she had no uncle. Her name was Boboluchi, which could be said to mean spirited one, and not to be outdone by the other maidens. She said, "I have an uncle who's going to bring me silks and satins and jewels." Now, as it happened, there was a robber taking a rest at the well who was disguised as a peddler. He was a covetous man in all ways, and he was disguised as a peddler going around selling perfumes to the peasant women in the lands. And he was quite taken by Boboluchi because she was very, very lovely. So he made a plan. And the very next day, he found out where Boboluchi lived, and dressing himself up as a rich merchant, he came to Boboluchi's door, carrying silks and satins and jewels, and said to her, "I am your long-lost uncle, the brother of your father, and I've come to take you to have your proper heritage." So Boboluchi believed what he was saying, and so she took her little bag of goods, her clothing, and she followed him. But as they were making the long journey, and it was quite a long journey, Boboluchi heard the birds singing, "Beautiful girl, beware. Nothing is as it seems. There is danger in the air." And Boboluchi said to the robber, Did you hear what the birds were saying?" He said, "Oh no, that's just the birds tweeting." And then further along, they came across a little fox, and the fox said the same thing. "Beautiful girl, beware, there is danger in the air." Boboluchi said, "Do you hear what that fox?" And the robber said, No, this is just a fox doing what a fox does." And so it went on, and also the trees said the same thing. But Boboluchi listened to what the robber was saying when he decried what it was that these creatures were telling Boboluchi. But when they came to the robber's house and he took her in, he locked the door. But first he introduced her to his aged mother. But he told her then of what his true intent was, who he was, and that he intended to marry her, take her for himself. And so he said, I leave you in the care of my mother while I go and buy all of the accoutrements that are necessary for our marriage. So off he went to do just that, leaving Boboluchi with the ancient crone. Now Boboluchi had magnificent hair. It fell from her head down to her tailbone, and the old mother, who was an old crone, did not have a hair on her head, and she said to Boboluchi, "Oh, if only I had hair like you have, how I've longed to have hair like you. How did you get your beautiful hair?" And Boboluchi said, "Well, my mother banged me on the head with a mallet, and every time she hit me, a hair grew." And the old crone said, "Well, perhaps you can try it on me." So Boboluchi did just that and started banging the old woman on her head, but of course cracked the skull. And so she was gone, dead. So Boboluchi dressed the old crone in the wedding gear that had been taken out and prepared for her, sat her on the chair with a spinning wheel in front of her, and then put on the garb of the old woman herself. So she was able to escape from the locked house because she found the key in the old crone's pocket. But as she was on the road making her escape, along comes the robber with all the goods that he'd bought for the wedding, and she was afraid that he would recognize her. But she was disguised so well in the old crone's clothing that he passed her by without blinking. So Boboluchi was able to make her escape. But of course, as it happened, the robber had bought himself, or stolen, so it said, a millstone that he wanted to grind the grain that was going to provide the food for the wedding feast. So when he came home and he saw what was apparently his bride sitting in the chair weaving, as of course, as wives should do, and he spoke to her and there was no response, he got very angry, as robbers might do. And so when there was no reaction, he threw the millstone, which happened to hit the old woman on the head. She fell out of her chair on the floor, and he saw that it was his beloved mother. So he was absolutely overcome with the terrible tragedy of what he'd done. But then, of course, not only did he covet Boboluchi, but he wanted to take his revenge on her for what had happened to his mother. So Boboluchi knew this, and she was very afraid when she went back that the robber was going to come and hunt her down. He knew where she lived. So Boboluchi spent each night at a different neighbor's house. But of course, soon she ran out of neighbors who would take her in and allow her to sleep in their house, and she had to face her fear and go back to her own house to sleep. But sure enough, just as her fear had said, in the middle of the night, while she was sleeping but now awake because she heard what was going on, the robber and several of his cahoots came along, and they came in to carry off her bed. And but Boboluchi, being the being that she was, took care to take into her bed with her the scythe that she used to cut the grass. And so, pretending to be asleep as the robbers carried off her bed, two of them at her feet, and the robber of our story at her head. So when they came out as she was pretending to be asleep, and they carried her bed off, when they had to set the bed down, of course, Boboluchi had the opportunity to be able to use her scythe to chop off the heads of the robbers who were at the foot of her bed. But our robber, who was at her head, escaped and was running away. And so Boboluchi chased him, and he climbed up a tree. And Boboluchi stood at the foot of the tree, and she said, "Come down, be a man and face me." But he was deathly afraid. And so Boboluchi went off and got some kindling and put it under the tree and set fire to the tree. So of course the robber was very afraid, and he jumped down from the tree and broke his neck. So Boboluchi was able to go back to his house and take all the loot that he'd gathered there, which is quite a lot, that allowed her to live happily, quite richly, thereafter. So it's said by the pundits that in each of us, there is a predominant archetype. So the question that arises out of this story, the teaser, the poser, is, what do you perceive as being? Who or what is the archetype in this story? Is it Boboluchi? And what does she represent? Is it the robber? What does he represent? What say you? Who is the predominant archetype in this story? If this story teases us, perhaps recognizing that, as has been said, every character in every story represents an aspect of ourselves, but if we ourselves were searching for our own predominant archetype, this story gives us an opportunity to be able perhaps to see how we would go about it in seeking for the archetype in this story. Could it possibly give us the means to be able for ourselves to glean what it is that is the predominant archetype in our own personal life? endeavouring to answer those questions that have been posed. A poser, a teaser of a story. What is the predominant archetype in this story? What is the predominant archetype in our own